Oh, I don't know why it keeps doing this. Oh, because I keep forgetting. Hey, we're gonna give people a few seconds to join in here and the conversation for the third part of the prophets. Okay, yeah, the video posted to the Discord. So here we go. We're live for the
Oh
third
yeah.
discussion of The Prophets by Robert Jones. Everybody, please click the description, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. I love how everyone who reads this book has so many tabs for it. I love that people are tabulating this book. But please click the
Yes.
description box. There's a link to the form to submit your questions. We need questions today. We've gotten no questions. So we know y'all got questions. Don't be scared. You do not have to put your name. You can submit your questions anonymously. But we
I have
need
questions.
yes, please. So I will send you the link to give to Robert Jones. Otherwise, I'm going to be up all evening curating questions. And this is why we try to meet y'all where y'all at, okay? Because if I start asking him questions, we're gonna be talking a whole lot about Timothy and
As we
Beyonce
should.
because those are the characters. All right, well, let me introduce my co-host. We have the very wonderful Mr. David. Are you a doctor officially?
No, not yet, but I'm gonna
Almost.
claim it.
You're a doctoral candidate up
Yes.
there.
Of
We
the
have
dissertation.
Yes, we have David John, who is here. Okay, what's the organization? Because I follow on Instagram, and you've been on the
Yeah.
Breakfast Club. You done challenge Charlemagne. You do the Black Boy Joy. You're always advocating. So, is there an official organization that you would like to
Yes.
align? Okay.
Yes. I am honored to be the quarterback of the team at the National Black Justice Coalition. And we're the nation's only civil rights organization at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA plus equality. So much like our brother Robert Jones Jr., we understand and celebrate that as long as there have been Black people, even before the terms existed, we showed up in what are now queer ways.
Yes. So, you do wonderful work. I'm always happy to see you. I'm
Thank you.
always so
Thank you.
proud. And thank you for all of your support. I really appreciate
Listen,
it.
I'm gonna say that before we get into it, in front of everybody in the YouTube interwebs, that I remain so very proud of you and the many ways you leverage your brilliance
Oh,
and your resources to help other people connect gaps or fill gaps and connect dots. I remain so very proud of you and am excited about all that is to come.
thank you. Thank you. You so wonderful. I had to sneak and send you that sweatshirt because you were not trying to you were not trying to accept you were not letting me give you your flowers while you could still smell them. So I had to sneak and find a P.O. box.
I
Because I was like,
appreciated
you
it.
know
This
what?
I was gonna wear it today, but it was too
It's too
warm. It's
hot.
too
It's too hot.
muggy
It's a
in
whole
DC. But I
sweatshirt.
was gonna wear it because it was on brand. But no, also because I didn't do. I know why you sent it, and I did what I did because I will always support you in whatever way I can. So I didn't do it in
I,
exchange for something.
I like celebrating my peoples though. So sometimes most of the time I'm gonna find every way to ensure that y'all let me know. Okay, so for this
Me too.
discussion, we're doing Nebuchadnezzar. Woo, I have not been to a religious institution in a very long time. So
But
Nebuchadnezzar,
Robert took us to the deepest of churches.
this is one of them names. And this whole section is a lot of very strong biblical references.
Yeah,
Nebuchadnezzar to Lamentations. If we happen to get further, because this is our last discussion before our author chat with Robert Jones, again, please click the form link in the description box and submit your questions. Please do.
please.
But this is our last discussion, so we'll go as far as we can go because it's not that everything needs to be precisely discussed, but we do want to go over and help engage an audience deeper in a reading, especially because Mr. Jones himself definitely follows in the vein of Mother Toni Morrison, and I know sometimes that can be a complicated sort of reading to push through in that sort of writing style or complex rather. And so we want to make sure that we kind of reach all knowledge bases. So I'm going to start. We're using the syllabus, and I'm going to start on page 44. So I'm going to read the summary, And then if there's like anything particular from this section that you would like to address, we could just get
Okay.
into it. And if the
Okay.
biblical references are really poignant for this section, we put all the biblical references in the syllabus, though the biblical references aren't really needed for you to necessarily understand the reading. But we did feel that like having biblical references might also help with the context of understanding the motifs and messaging, because a lot of it is actually sort of like, was it, it's ironic or perpendicular to what was happening, the way the church sees these biblical references. So the summary for Nebuchadnezzar, Maccabees, the Revelation of Judas, Chronicles, and Bel and the Dragon is that in these sections, Isaiah visits Timothy, and Samuel finds out about their encounter. Amos attempts to tell Paul about Isaiah and Samuel's relationship, and Maggie attempts to stop him. The voices tell the story of foolishness of those who attempt to gain power by siding with the oppressor. This section ends by Kosi recollecting their experiences on the slave ship and the moments that led to their kidnapping. So I would love for your thoughts on Timothy and the way he pursues Isaiah.
Yeah, and pursuit is a nice word. The way that he rapes Isaiah
Yes.
is the word that I actually want to use, in part because the legacy of Tony and brother Uncle Jimmy, and now brother Jones is to name a thing a thing. And Timothy shows up much like Covey, the slave master in Douglas's narrative of the life of a slave.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm so thankful for in the gift that Robert has given us and Brother Jones Jr. has given us is that so many people gloss over the reality that male identified enslaved people, which is a vexing thing anyway, right? When we're
Yeah.
talking about chattel slave, to then think about them as men is a contradiction. It doesn't exist, right? But Frederick Douglass is the first person to attempt to write about this process of becoming a man. And I've always felt like we jumped over that so much of his motivations were a result of not wanting to be raped. And in particular, the passage where he talks about becoming a man, where he names the process of becoming a man, he's talking about this physical struggle with this white man named Covey. The
Mm-hmm.
difference for me in the presentation of whiteness in this regard is that Timothy is offered up to us as someone who is soft, to go back to one of these larger themes of the balance, right? Like Samuel and Isaiah offering the perfect balance of soft and hard. Timothy is soft compared to the more masculine white folk that we are introduced to. And there's a way in which him as a painter, right, one who is an artist, a soft occupation, him as someone who is born in the South but becomes a man or an adult in the North, right? Who there's a passage, and I think it's much later, but it's Timothy talking about how cotton in the South is akin to snow falling in the Northeast,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, and that's set with me because in both cases, whiteness is enveloping, and in a way that I think I remember Samuel or Isaiah saying, like, I want no parts of. I don't want to be in a place where whiteness falls and is it all encompassing in that regard. And Timothy's form of white supremacy and dominance is presented as something that should feel more palatable than the otherwise brutish nature of enslavement and white supremacy and homophobia and all the other things that we can now name, but maybe didn't exist in an easily accessible way then. Um, and it bothers me. Like he sits in the crevices of my soul in ways that vex me.
Mm. Yeah, I thought his character was very profound to like modern day whiteness. I mean, it all is, right? We're really not that far away from the plantation. Uh, but that, like, as you were saying, like all these soft notes about him. And oftentimes when people will speak out about violence, regardless of their gender identity, the idea is that, oh, well, I know that person and they're nothing like that. And I do
Right.
appreciate that Jones just kind of trouble the way we perceive all these outside factors about a person, but that doesn't negate the actions that they take. That
Right.
doesn't, just because he offered freedom, in a time where like what does a white man's words mean to a black person? Like
That's right.
there is no authority that will hold him accountable for any of the things that he says or really any of the things
That's
that he does. And so there was always, as Jones points out, and as soon as Isaiah or any black person steps over the threshold into that home, there's a dynamic where they are never going to win. It's an immediate loss for them, and they know that like the most that they might come out is alive, and that's it.
That's true. And I recall that got that coming up in the previous conversation you had. And there's a way in which that hope is also present for everybody on the plantation, for everybody on Empty, right? For me, the note that I wrote in the book is that Empty is cold. And it's not lost on me that in spite of all of the attempts to make Timothy this dynamic whole person, he himself is cold, right? Like I wondered if Timothy had partners in the Northeast, and if their gender identification really didn't matter. I didn't feel like he could open himself up to receive the kind of interaction. I won't even name love, but the kind of interaction that it seemed he was seeking out of raping property.
Mhm.
I do appreciate also that like the backdrop of Timothy and his coldness for me made much more palpable how vibrant and how beautiful the love between Samuel and Isaiah is, right? So there's the on page 210 when they first start having this conversation, there's the line at the end, in their quiet places, out of the sight of anyone who might judge it horribly or use it against them or give them away for which they were truly unprepared. They weren't intent on receiving it. And then Timothy cried, but his eyes also rolled into the back of his head, just like Samuel's and Isaiah's did. And Isaiah did everything he knew not to do to ensure those faces, those expressions. Samuel and Timothy's didn't merge. Somehow he knew that once they did, only death would be able to untangle them. And then he hops to the end of the chapter where he writes on 216, Isaiah threw his arms around Samuel. He held him for a moment before weeping into his shoulder. Samuel held him tight. Then he pushed him back so that he could see his face. His hands caressed his chest, then moved down to his navel. Isaiah reclined, and Samuel moved forward and then rested his palm against Isaiah's firm belly. With his finger, he traced the boundaries of Isaiah's body. And so, like, first chapter of the book, I got clear pictures. I'm like, I need to see this on the big screen. How tangible and palpable their love is.
Mhm.
But it was after the introduction of Timothy that I felt like the brushstrokes got like bolder and richer, and I got to feel the light between these two beings.
I mean,
I
it is
just love.
true because in the book, like even when every description of Isaiah and Samuel, it's like the lightness emanating through the melanin, right? The lightness that emanates
Mhm,
through their darkness. And
mhm.
I keep going back to like we read Hortense Spillers, and I'm never gonna stop talking about the fact that we read Mama's Baby. But like
Yours should
she
be.
talks about the language, right? Like what we do with the American grammar, and I think there is that Jones takes on a lot of work to kind of untether ourselves from this American grammar that informs us that like because we are dark, therefore we are dark, right?
Right,
And that we
right.
cannot emanate the light, but that actual you are so rich in color that it's not you're not dark in an absence of color. You are dark in a richness of color, and that richness emanates light and warmth. And there is a lot of tenderness in this book. I think as you call him Uncle Jimmy, but in the vein of like James Baldwin, this like how rare it is that in literature, even to this day, that we get to see black men express tenderness to each other.
Right, right.
I've been
Yeah,
thinking about that a lot because I just reposted an interview I did with Kiese Layman, and I was like, yeah, there's not really a lot of media that expresses, regardless of sexuality, that showcases a real tenderness between black men.
no, because to be a black man in the way in which it has been socially constructed means to be everything but tender, everything but soft, everything but vulnerable, everything but feminine, which is, again, to a point that you've made, one of the beautiful things that Robert Jones Jr. does, which is highlight that we are nothing if we are not balanced. if we don't find the space in the middle. Now I have India replaying in the back of my head, but literally the thing that I love is I was trying to find the actual passage. It's later in the book, and I didn't want to spoil anything, but I appreciate you giving us a little bit of grace. But he talks about Isaiah wanting to be Samuel's peace, and acknowledging that Samuel could not, he wasn't capable of being softer, even in moments where like the spirits possessed him and otherwise cajoled him into doing so. Um, and Isaiah understood that. And a part of like his assignment, a part of his purpose was to be this man's peace, and not in a way that made him a punk. In fact, to me, in a way that makes him much stronger a man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which again, to trouble this idea that people feel like effeminate men or men who are bottoms are receptive, right, are anything but men. It takes more work to do that.
Yeah.
But there's something beautiful about the way that they have been written as men without equivocation, and all of the things that that comes to mean to us. And they are able to be soft for one another in ways that is not just about reproduction, to go to another theme in the book, and one of the consequences of colonization and the Bible, but for the purposes of helping somebody be their best self.
You're just explaining it so beautifully. I'm just gonna let you keep talking, but let's move on to some other unsavory Black people on Empty. Amos.
Okay. Okay. Oh,
So
dude. Okay. Yeah.
so in this part of the book, Amos is making a case towards Paul in which he thinks there is some sort of, I don't know, what is it that Amos is after in going to Paul and explaining what Isaiah and Samuel are up to? What does, like, how is that of benefit to Amos? And in the syllabus, it actually asks on page 46, how does Amos reconcile Paul's faith and his relationship to the other slaves of Empty?
I don't think he does. I don't think that Amos reconciles or resolves much. I think that, so page 55 of the syllabus, to jump forward, but I think
Mm-hmm.
they're connected enough to not just tell me. But the question is, how might Isaiah's actions later in the book serve as a means of protection? And I wrote my response and then went back to thinking about Amos, because what I wrote is, what choice do enslaved people really have when you're under constant threat and the most insidious forms of violence? You really make choices that are informed by prioritizing survival. And I think if there's an answer to your question, is that Amos believed, and I think was told to believe, that religion would provide a balm, and maybe more than that, some form of protection. I don't think he did the work to, or we weren't shown that he did the work to then reconcile at what cost, and what might be some of the consequences.
Yeah, because as you're saying, like as an enslaved person, everything costs. And so it's since
And
yeah.
see, I get excited. As an enslaved person, everything costs. And one thing that I appreciate that Robert does is make clear that for those who are enslavers, everything costs too.
What do you mean for enslavers everything costs too?
So I think that there's a way that slave narratives to use. Is it Paris Paper? What's the brother's name who you spoke to before? Oh,
Oh,
the second
Paris perusing, paperback Paris.
Paris,
Yeah.
Paris Peruzzi. He was talking about like slave, and one of the tropes that I think is frequently offered is that white folks, in particular white women, are never guilty. They never have blood on their hand, literally or figuratively, and there are few literal individuals who are made culpable for all that exists with regard to the transatlantic enslavement process. And there's a way in which all of the two Bobs are written in ways that we are clear that their shit stinks. And there's a literal scene about that, right? Earlier in the book, where I think Robert Jones Jr. makes clear that for everyone touched and tainted by the project of enslavement, that there's a cost.
Yeah, like it's interesting when you were saying when you were reiterating the point about like white women and the whiteness, because to the point of Ruth, I had made a point when I was talking to Paris, and he was like, "Well, no, it is, like she knows what she's doing, right? But there is this sort of like she doesn't have to care about what she's doing." And it goes so far as like we have a scene between Ruth and both Paul that involves shit,
Right.
and they're not embarrassed by it. Like there isn't this, like imagine what it costs us to literally step in a pile of horse shit, or what it would cost a slave who doesn't get to bathe regularly, who does not have access to like all the things an enslaved person doesn't have access to. But to her, it is like she literally jumps over a fence like a dunce in the middle of the night, lands in a pile of shit, and like I think, oh my gosh, how embarrassing. And to her, she's like, oh my camera will come back
Oh
on in a
well.
second. Yeah.
Yep.
To her, it
Yep. She
just
can keep on going on about her business. Right. Yeah. Meanwhile, we have to be mindful of keeping white clothes clean while doing the dirtiest jobs. And the irony about the ways in which the politics of respectability still endure, related to contemporary conversations about how nasty, especially privileged white people are with regard to not bathing or knowing
mm-hmm.
any parts of soap and water on a regular
Because
basis.
not a white person in this book thought to bathe after doing their nastiness. These
At
people like plunk on the
all.
bed after. I'm just like, baby, you are dirty. And when you talk about this conversation about like white people proudly saying that they don't consistently wash themselves, I think when you even bring in like fat phobia and classism, how much I see like there's a trend of working class plus size black women who have wild collections of bathing products.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like all of this is connected. All of this is rooted. Like
It
it's
is.
so insipid the way that generational trauma
Yeah.
has had such a stronghold, and it's an institution in itself, right? It is
Yeah.
not that like an individual can break those sort of chains. We have so many institutions and infrastructures, as like a Dr. Patricia Collins pointed out in Matrix of Domination, that it constantly replicates itself. And here in this book, these white characters, they really do just trounce around and do some just disgusting things and then lay out on the bed.
Yes. And invite other people to lay with them, not invite force
Yeah, there was no invitation. There was no turning.
at all.
That
Right.
was a straight
There was no
grooming.
opportunity to decline.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's nasty. It was then, it is now. Yeah.
So to continue on about the well, let's first talk a little bit about memory. On page 47 of the syllabus, it pulls a quote from page 243. Where they discuss the keeper of memory, and it asks, what is the significance of the keeper of memory as it relates to African ancestry, according to the following quote? He would need to be the keeper of memory so that everything Kasongo, down to the dust of the ground, would live on. I actually think when we go back to Kasongo and Alewa and Kosi and King Akosa, that
Yeah.
like to me it just reminds like how far we've come in a sense. Like, do you have a right to hold on to that memory?
Right.
Also, and then when you deal with the level of trauma that any enslaved person deals with, but especially as it's drawn out on empty, what how do we define memory? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in this idea, like especially when it comes to this conversation about African Americans having culture,
Right.
that we have to be able to explicitly say it came from this place in 15 something in AD in BC,
That's
and
a lie.
you
Yeah,
know
from the pit of white
we
supremacy hell. Hmm.
yeah, we don't get to hold like and then we eschew all the little moments that really put together this very vibrant culture.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think all that's right. And I was listening earlier today to Brittany Packnett's podcast on Meteor. And there was a discussion with the sister who's behind the Nat Ministry and her righteous declaration that we, those of us who are the descendants of enslaved Africans here, have a claim to this land. And I remember being an elementary school student buying into the lie that I'm homeless, that I'm without an actual language or a native tongue, and should otherwise feel deficient in that regard, and very much stand firmly in claiming all of what this country is as a result of the contributions that we have made. To the specific connection around memory, I think that, again, for me, it's balance. I'm inviting into this conversation a mentor, Freeman Rabowski, who's the president of UMBC, who says that we should not be beholden to the tyranny of either or, but be liberated by the beauty of both and. And I think about, I'll try not to spoil the book, but I think about the ways that memory, and the ability to have a relationship with a memory keeper. And for me, as it shows up in my life, to have dialogue with the ancestors allows the events to unfold in the way that they do at the end of the book, right? In ways that are otherwise phantasmagorical to some.
That's such
Um,
a great word. Phantasmagorical.
oh, it's one of my favorites.
I can't even
Um,
say it.
Yeah, no, you said it. You said it right, but that's what it is, right? Like, it's very much the things that you referenced in previous conversations, talking about underground and other things that are connected. Um, Having a connection to and a commitment to reclaiming memories, both difficult ones, because there are a couple of moments where Robert Jones Jr. ruminates on, or has characters ruminate on the pain, the difficulty of telling stories to children, especially about this process, and we just have to reckon with that. I think that there's also power in being able to rename, reclaim, and create new memories, right? And so one of the things that I will always be mad at Amos about is the way that he used his knowledge about Isaiah's name. Is it Isaiah? Was it Isaiah or Samuel? It was Isaiah, right? Isaiah's name.
Oh, it was
Um,
Isaiah. Yeah, when he had Isaiah's original
Yeah,
name. Yeah.
when he used his name against him to say, well, if you do this, then I will exchange this for you. Then I brought to mind Dr. King's But If Not sermon, and this idea that, like, there are things that we as people who are connected to a higher being know that we are compelled to do, and question whether or not Amos ever had that feeling, and then if the invitation or the request from Paul was a righteous one. But it sent me down this spiral. And let me land this plane by saying that I think for us as Black folks who are still doing a lot of this work, right, which is why I love so much the poem, and the beseechment at the end, the invitation to us, the capital YOU, is this ability to reclaim parts of our story that white supremacy continues to try and erase, acknowledging that there are tools for our liberation there. And so, very much connected to the way I show up in the world as a Black, same gender loving man. I don't use the term gay, in part because of the way that naming works, because gay makes people think about sex. It doesn't make anybody think about love at all. It's also a white male political identifier. When people think about gay things, the things that I love and the way that I show up in the world is not close to that. So I use same gender loving, right? And so much of what I love about the troubling of these tropes and dynamics and boundaries around gender is that there's an invitation for us to remember that it's white supremacy that did this shit to us.
Mm-hmm.
That, much like Amos told us to hate one another. And so I keep this book near me on my bookshelf, The Spirit of Intimacy,
Pull it over to
by,
this.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
The Spirit of Intimacy by Some Sombufu.
Yeah.
And there's in
It
chapter
must be
13
good
of this
because you have
book.
a whole lot of tabs in that book.
Oh, it is. And here's what's interesting. So chapter 13 is titled Homosexuality,
Yeah.
and the subtitle is The Gatekeepers, similar to the prophets names, right? And what Some says is the words gay and lesbian do not exist in the village, but there is the word gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are people who live a life at the edge between two worlds, the world of the village and the world of the spirit, right? Actually, I usually stop there, but this is even more significant. Though they do not marry in this world, they say they have partners in other dimensions. And I stop myself because that part is usually not relevant and leads people down another path where then they
Yeah.
start to think about marriage equality. But it's even more relevant now because of this desire to force them to procreate, right? To be married in ways that benefit cis het white folks, who in this time would have been cis het Protestant landowning and all these other things that are meant to make a man or a woman. And so I'm hoping that um, Black folks who proclaim to love Black folks but don't want to love all of us, and who fashion themselves hoteps without appreciating the ideological roots of the word, will digest this medicine, which is to me the balm of acknowledging the damage that white supremacy continues to do. Right? That the king is a female identified person who is as strong as they are compassionate should surprise none of us who have relationships to Black women. And when I say women, I always mean cis and trans, right? Um, that we see in the most in the least of these, to use a term my Black Baptist grandfather would use, like this special light, these special gifts, these special abilities should surprise none of us who have relationships to Black folks, in particular Black queer folks. The thing that I struggle most with, especially now having more resources like this newest gift, is failing to understand how people, again, who purport to care about us don't appreciate that this has always been us, that we have always shown up in these ways. And it is literally a tool of whiteness to try and convince us anything otherwise.
I have to get that book now. Oh,
I'll send it to you.
oh man, I start grad school on Tuesday, so no promises on how
I
quickly.
want you'll read it when you read it, but you will have it. And I'm gonna order from a Black owned bookstore. Your store, but if they have it, if not, they'll have to order it.
Okay. All right. So the next quote that I wanted to talk about, and this quote, I feel like, is it Maggie who says this quote on 246? So what chapter actually? Let me be clear about what chapter we're actually in, because we've been here for a minute.
246 is still before Paul. What's before
It's Bell and
Paul?
the Dragon.
Yeah, that's 246. That's the last page.
Yeah. A curse upon
Okay,
you and all of your progeny. May you wreath in ever pain. May you never find satisfaction. May your children eat themselves alive.
mm-hmm.
And is this um Kosi after he saw Alewa's body? But it was
Yeah. And
it was
keep going though, right? But it was too late, and the curse had no meaning because it was redundant. So
why would it
the
be
curse,
redundant?
because it's already manifested. It's
Mm.
already manifested, right? Let's go back to the opening chapter when we realize in maybe Maggie that only one of her children survived. Timothy, right? Like
Ruth, you mean Ruth? Only
Ruth.
one of her
Sorry,
children survived. Yeah.
Ruth. Yeah. Sorry about Ruth and Paul. Yes, that Timothy was the only one that survived. So it was before Maggie. The chapter was Maggie that
And
came after, right?
even that to interrupt you though, even that train of thought, you think about it's redundant, right? Because the white folks are even more messed up than we are. But what they've done, back to the American grammar, so many things that would possibly be a blessing depending on the person, we, because they come from a Black body, are seen as a
Right.
curse. So Ruth
That's
only
right.
has one child that survives. Maggie,
Right.
who decides that because she is not allowed to be a mother, that she is never
Right.
going to emotionally invest in the offspring that are forced out of her,
Right.
has, as it turns out in the end of the book, very powerful offspring,
Right.
right? And so, but because she is a woman, therefore she's a Black woman, she is therefore seen as a piece of cattle and not a human being. And then we
Right.
still carry this idea of, I think it's so crazy that in the 21st century there are Black women that sit on the internet and call Black women, what is it, bench something. Oh, I done blocked that term so far
Bedouin.
out my mind that I can't even remember it. Tariq Nasheed,
Bedouin.
yeah, a bed wench. That, like, and it's like, do you understand?
Do you understand the words that are coming out of your mouth?
Do you,
Most of the
like,
time,
who
no.
told you these things? You know what I mean? Where did you get this from? Do
Right.
you understand where you are getting these things from? And even Paul, like, and then Paul and Timothy, like, and Paul in particular, for all, and we're moving into the next section about him anyway. Paul is the all powerful, and still cannot be honest with himself.
And at least in theory, I always appreciate, and there are at least three moments that come to mind. I think in three, so that might be me, that Robert Jones Jr. makes clear that while they have munitions, they are almost always outnumbered, right? So I love that in the beginning chapters of the book, every reference to a Black female identified character, there's also a reference to a weapon or them thinking about committing some form of violence. And then later in the book, there are more clear references to how many enslaved people exist on Empty and how they outnumber the few poor white folks who had to sell themselves into being slave watchers, right? And so, yes, Paul is positioned to be powerful, and there are ways in which we see him and interact with his children and others that reveal his lack of or his powerlessness.
So actually, let's move into the next section because I found it quite fascinating, and this is a question that I will put for the author chat, that we get new characters introduced rather late in the book.
Yeah.
With the character of Adam, who turns out to
Yeah.
be the half, or the biracial son of Paul. So, in the sections of Paul, Adam, and Samuel, we learn of Paul's inheritance of the Elizabeth plantation from his father Jonah, which he was told was his God given birthright. We learn of Paul's agreement with Amos to teach him the word of the God to share with the enslaved. We learn of Adam, Paul's biracial son, who carries many of the same features and drives the carriage when Paul leaves the plantation. Samuel depicts the plan between Samuel and Isaiah to escape the plantation, but now before a final encounter between, oh, that's a typo, but not before a final encounter between Samuel and Timothy. So
Yeah.
much this is actually a very long section, and there is so much that
Yes.
that happens here.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Paul's name is
We see other parts of the town. We leave Empty.
we
We go
finally get off
downtown.
Empty. This
Right.
is there is a lot visually happening here, and even in the depiction of Adam, and like how his balding was a sign that, like, wow, I really had a child that long ago. For Paul, even Paul's name, right? Because in the Bible, Paul was an apostle known as a Saint Paul, and he shared the gospel of Jesus to the New World, founded churches in Asia Minor and Europe, and served as counsel to the Jewish and Romans. And so, like, in the Bible, Paul isn't Paul the one who does all the like, goes to all the congregations, like First
Yes.
Corinthians, Second
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Corinthians,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Thessalonians, and
The Apostle Paul was one of the first evangelists. Yes.
yeah, and I guess Paul in the book is, I mean, he, you know what? He is an evangelist, because evangelists definitely believe in manifest destiny. So I'll give that. I'll give that to Paul of the book.
He is an evangelist, and there's a way in which Robert Troubles, at least for me, reminds us that the Bible was fed to us as stories that were written by men. And so there's a way in which I find that he reminds me to be critical when revisiting the word, such that I'm relying upon my relationship with the Lord, not somebody's interpretation of what that relationship must look like.
Hmm. Yeah, he definitely makes you think about, and I mean, this is the second book that we've read like this, and it's interesting because both of the books deal with queer identity. Akweke Emezi's Freshwater,
Mm-hmm.
which does just an also a very complex book, but the character in that book, the Ada, is literally, I don't know, at the time of writing it, Akweke realized it was DID, dissociative identity disorder. But the Ada, they have a splintering of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the splinters of the mind is Jesus, or is a character who is in the light of Jesus, and is like Christianity, and the role that Christianity both sort of carries that character through and
Yeah.
saves them from. But it's not Christianity, it's a spirituality. It's a
Got it.
spirituality that sort of carries them through and keeps them from unaliving themselves. But it's also uh something that does harm them in the process. But the harm is always covered in, like, oh, but I love you, but I'm gonna let me stab you, but I love you. It's a very
Yeah.
complex. I'm probably not doing a good job of explaining the book. I
No,
love Freshwater.
it's enticing, and folks who are intrigued should now read it for themselves. But no, I love
Yes,
that.
because the
But I,
Adam also splinters into like a non-binary identity, and there's in they're Igbo and they're Nigerian, and so there's all these different roots that kind of connect back and really is a commentary on the way we weaponize religion and
yeah.
use it to harm each other.
In the ways that this is a commentary on the ways that we weaponize gender. And I love that there are so many references to choice or what should have been choice before things were imbalanced.
Mm-hmm.
And it just acknowledges that there otherwise should be more fluidity with regard to that process. So I felt like Adam was, and this is, I said this before, so it's another thing. He was a foil for helping me, one, further appreciate how problematic Paul is still to this day, and not being able to reconcile what is his relationship with his progeny, especially given their proximity. There also were a number of lines where I felt that he was helping me even further appreciate the love between Samuel and Isaiah. So on page 283, Adam asks, what it feel like. Adam asked quietly, knowing full well the answer would never satisfy, to have each other. Samuel winced, but Isaiah brought in his chest like it's supposed to. When I tell you I read that and just had to put the book down and just like, I just felt warm. Like to know and be settled in your soul that like you found your person. So this is the thing that I love about this. I went to Columbia. I'm still at Columbia now, but as an undergraduate student, and one of the ways that white supremacy works with regard to privilege is that Columbia forces every student to read the same set of books for the first 2 years of the undergraduate experience. And most of the books, no surprise, are white and European by nature. And there are a lot of Greek plays. And one of the things that I latched onto first year was reading about Dionysus and this idea that love exists between what becomes two beings, but as a result of the splintering of one soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for folks who are like, I don't want to go down that path. If you've ever heard Amel LaRue sing "Make Me Whole," it is what she's singing about when she's talking about her husband and her manager LaRue. This idea that that you are the only person that completes me. What Amel says is. Your eyes are the windows to heaven. Your smile can heal a million souls. Your love completes my existence. You're the only other half that makes me whole. And there's a way throughout this book that if there's one thing that I'm clear about as a reader, is that these two halves exist to make one whole. And there are moments in the book where I ask myself, is this one person? Right? To your point about cognitive dissonance and the way in which we sometimes have to splinter parts of ourselves to endure experiences, I'm going to read the book again. This will be my second time, not like Oh Boy's third time. I'm going to get there. But I'm
Jared.
going to read it again and ask Jared. Yes, I'm going to ask more questions about that dynamic because their wholeness and this halfness is something that for me was a thread throughout the entire book. And Adam asked them these questions that allow them to answer in ways that make that clear to me.
Adam to me was just a very troubled character. Um,
Yeah, understandably so. You sit next to your daddy, you can't even look him in the face.
I was like, damn, maybe I should have more sympathy for the biracial struggle.
No,
Um,
well, there's yes, we should. All of us, yes. You should. There's also this way that Robert writes that is just like, can we just put some of this shit on t-shirts and etch it in the mountain? So on page 288, and it's usually when he's like reading whiteness. So 288, it starts at the bottom of 287. But the line is niggas weren't lazy, niggas were tired, bone tired.
yeah. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Word to
Listen,
Fannie Lou Hamer. You know,
listen.
I think one of the things that struck me too was that Adam is presented as a splintered character, but I guess at your point of like I don't know, do I see Adam as balanced? But like Auntie B, Balua was splintered, and I was just, oh baby, you crazy right off the bat.
Yeah.
Like right, but there are several characters who are splintered. And I mean, for me, that kind of registers about like, what does trauma do to our what does trauma do to us, does do to our psyche, do to us psychologically, and also like the way we are just so tethered to ableism, but that ableism harms us in so many ways. And I'm thinking of uh her ad on TikTok is Crushes and Spice. Imani, I forget their last name, who's always advocating for disability rights. And like their point is that so much of like the ableism that's harmful to disabled folks is directly in line with racism. Like they go
Yeah,
hand in hand. This
yeah,
idea that we can just dispose or get rid of people allows us to get rid of black people.
yes. And playing the oppression Olympics is, to go back to Sister Collins's point, the only way that the matrix of domination is maintained. Which is why, again, go back to, you cannot purport to care about Black folks if you don't care about all of us
Mhm.
and all parts of us all of the time.
I
If
mean,
if
Anna
we
Julia
step out,
Cooper told us that in A Voice from the South, but like, it's been so long and so clear. And I think what I love about Jones's work is that, particularly with like an Amos character, you see this like pursuit of power and domination. You see how
yeah,
foolish it is because it's so clear how you are going to get nothing in return. But even when you remove us from the plantation in 2021, we are still fighting for so little. We are giving up of ourselves and selling our community downriver for so little.
yes, but the question is, what experiences did Amos have before he made the request and let him know that?
That he even had a
I
possibility.
Right, like so much of there's a this isn't the passage I was looking for, but on 183, the king is talking, and this is when Alewa and Kosi are dancing, and King Kosi is responding to the dirty Tubab in this space, and is essentially like their courtship has been witnessed and approved by generations of ancestors. They are bonded. The dead are silly. The king thought silly, foolish, and reckless, which was perhaps why they intruded here, cast out from wisdom. They wandered, confusing everyone they encountered. Right. So uh, I think for me, two things. One is one of the ways that I love Robert Jones Jr.'s Black feminist manifesting is that we get the most context for the way in which trauma shows up for Black female identified characters, right? It's not that B Auntie is crazy in the way that we are traditionally told to talk about Black women or Black folk or Black folks with disabilities, who are most of us. Um, but we get to see the way she's pushed, I think, is the way that the story is told, right? From a place where she was softer to a space where she can't be soft at all. And, and the same isn't offered for, and I'm not saying that it should be. Let me be clear about that. Um, but there isn't this struggle, this context for like how Amos came to be and why he's making these decisions. And there's a part of me that honestly I struggle with this, right? Like I know homophobic ass Black folks who purport to care about Black folks who really think that they love and are doing race work.
I mean, is it? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think maybe for Amos, it is that like, the Pueblo Ferrer theory. I might be butchering that man's name, but pedagogy of the oppressed, right? That one of the things that in order to live as an oppressed people, the oppressor has to live within you. And so, because of Amos's identifying as a man, he makes the mistake. Like, and maybe it is that like that sort of patriarchy allows him in a way that most of the women identifying characters in the book don't really get to feed into seeing themselves as women. And it matter and
Mm-hmm.
in most ways, in order to protect themselves, they actually push
Mm-hmm.
back against the ways we uphold, like we believe in femininity or this idea of
Mm-hmm.
motherhood in the American sense. But that he somehow sees a reflection of himself in the slave master, that he, based on
I want
his
to.
gender
Yeah.
identity, sees that there is a line that would connect him and Paul to each other, and that
Yeah.
potentially would suggest that against all odds there's something
Yeah.
Word to the young philosopher, young Carisha, it's something, it's something
Right.
that would, make this worthwhile.
Right. Acknowledging Diddy or love or whatever he's going, there's something there,
Something,
right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
something.
think that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's something there. Yeah, yeah.
It's
And
something.
and not just his gender, his heterosexual relationship to his partner in the way that they're allowed to be, the way that they show up as a couple in proximity to Paul and Ruth, like all of that makes sense. And that has to be the only thing that makes sense is
I
not the
mean,
right word. This
it's
is
in
where
the
Lady
same
was
way that
going
we
for.
aspire, like we protect billionaires. Like, what is
So,
informing you that you have any possibility
of
of
becoming one.
but we will.
Because Riri did it.
I mean, but there's no ethical way to do it either, though. Like, okay, Rihanna did it, and Rihanna is so
Yeah, but
far
most
away
people,
from the.
but you just did what white people do when you move the goalposts. Nobody said anything about becoming an ethical billionaire. Folks are just like, I want the billions.
Right, but what
Right,
is
which takes us back to the conversation we're just having, right? If we want liberation and freedom, then we have to do the work of making sure all of us are
and what's
liberated.
telling you that there's any like our entire life especially in America has told us that we are never going to get there, that we are never going to be allowed the opportunity to truly supposedly put your head down and hustle to get to that point, but we will feed into that narrative to the harm of our own people. We will dispose of other people based on wanting to align ourselves with billionaires who have.
And in particular, the people who are closest to being free in ways that we espouse to want to know and be able to experience. Yeah.
Well, to close out, we'll have to end here because we're coming up on the hour. What
Already?
what did you make of Samuel and Timothy's encounter? And
Oh Jesus.
does
We
that
we
get
should have
into the
started we should have started
started with
here.
that?
Have
Oh,
been going backwards. Um oh my God, so many things. How do I order my thoughts? I had my body had a visceral response. I convulsed at the moment when Timothy asked Samuel to bring Isaiah.
mm.
And I thought like I think the note I wrote in the book was like the fucking audacity that like that that yeah, I traced back like all of their interactions and him forcing him out of the river and to sit in this chair. There's a moment that Robert seared in my brain around like I've always seen black folks, but never seen them sit in a chair because we don't get to rest, right? Like I thought about like all of the labor expended to lure um, this beautiful black body into his bed to consume him, and laughed at the irony of it being the thing that ended up consuming him. There was something righteous in that for me. Um, I also found myself asking if it were not for Timothy, if I'm trying not to give away the end.
Go ahead, because this is the last discussion. You
If
can
things
take it away. You want to talk about Maggie and Samuel?
uh, I wonder if things would have turned out differently, right? I wonder if the fire would have been brought, literally and figuratively, if it were not for Timothy raping in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I struggle with that. And in particular, I thought about here's the last thing I'll say. The personal thing is I will be 40 next year, and I think a lot about growing in love. Um, I think a lot about growing in love and loving other black men has been challenging. And so often I'm told that the remedy is to date white men.
I mean, that's
And aside from that,
very
you
same
said,
for
well,
white women. We're getting the same messaging as white women, as black women.
listen, and it's like aside from my like personal politics, I think a lot about the pillow talk between the two of them, which again I wish there was another word we think about, like the conversations one has in a fucking place or in their rape bed. But I think about some of the things that Timothy said that he probably felt were endearing, but that made my skin crawl. And I thought about how often, still to this day, people are forced into um, intimate physical encounters with folks that they otherwise would not choose to be in relationship with. Um, and it made me long for us to have more conversations about that and these dynamics and about sex and about healing and about wellness, such that we can get to a point where people can actually choose with the capital C, and not be constrained in the ways that are made clear in this book.
It's interesting because when it's suggested that you pursue a white partner because black love is so is is it tenuous, is it accessible, however we want to describe it, but the root of any ism we're dealing with is always white supremacy. So how does partnering with a white person resolve the
Go
white
solve that.
supremacy that lays the foundation for all the other bigoted issues that we deal with? And I
It
think
does.
about, like, when
No matter,
I
no matter.
literally been thinking a lot about, like, black men, well, particularly because I'm a woman who dates black men, is dating of cis het black men. But I'm also wondering, maybe I do know, or my sphere of influence tends to be that the queer identifying men that I know tend to be very educated black men, but that, and since I don't live in that space exactly, I don't, I'm not trying to ever speak on it, but maybe it is just that for cis men in general, there's so much violence they face in trying to expand how they are intimate with each other. And I know when I say intimate, people always go directly to sexual, but
Yeah,
it's that,
no.
even that, like, I as a
To be
black,
vulnerable.
yeah, I as a woman identifying person, I when I decided that I wanted to be a better friend, there was no barrier of entry, right? There was no, I might face violence if I try to have a more intimate relationship with any gender of my friends, right? Like, we had a top conversation with Adria Marie Brown, who wrote Pleasure Activism, and she was talking about, like, the benefits of truly platonic relationships, and
Yeah.
really making those intimate, like, being intimate with your platonic friends. So it's not sexual, but it's just being close, like acknowledging that you actually love these people, acknowledging that you actually have an emotional connection to these people. And I was like, there are so many things because of socialization that, like, why am I worried about getting naked in front of my friends? Why am I worried about having this sort of closeness with them if, like, they're my people?
Yeah.
So, like, I've just been working on being more vulnerable with my friends, and it's been great. I don't think black men have that same pathway. I think, especially for cis het
It's
black
not.
men, they
It
go out.
exists.
It exists, but, like, but also patriarchy has no gender, and women participate in this. Every gender participates, and, like, how often I have a friend that's married, and she's always calling me like, "Is my husband gay?" And I'm like, "Girl, no." Even if he
But why
is,
is she asking you like as if you wouldn't like have any?
because she's trying to
uh
work. She's trying to work through her own, like, the homophobia that she's ingrained about how she perceives a man should display his manhood. And I'm constantly like, think about how we talk about allowing ourselves to be free. Why would you not allow the man that you love
Celebrate or
that
want.
sort of
Yeah.
freeness as well?
Yeah.
And I think it's just difficult. So I've
Yeah.
just been thinking, like, how do we change that difficulty? I don't know. It's not an individual thing, but keep having reading books like this, keep having
No,
conversations like
it
this.
is very much an individual thing. I celebrate one of my closest friends is a brother named Aaron Jenkins. We call him the mayor of DC. And Aaron is, if I'm 6'5", Aaron is 6'5". Aaron is quick to tell another brother who he's in intimate, meaningful relationship with that he loves them. And there's nothing sexual about it. Not that it matters, but he's
I've been
married.
telling my homeboys that I love them, and it makes them very uncomfortable. I have a homeboy in particular who I and because I'm like, nigga, we just sat on the phone for 3 hours. You done cried. You done told
That's
me
love.
everything. Like, baby, I
That's
love
love.
you. That's like, I love you, nigga.
Right.
And he just be I love you too.
Yeah, he's got to work through it. I think about my grandfather has been present through all this conversation. I call him Papa. He passed January a year ago, and I remember it used to become a game when I was an undergrad. Before we get on the phone, I would always say to him, "I love you," and his response was always a one-word response that was anything other than love. So it was a grunt, it was a it was an acknowledgement, and then closer to his passing as he got even older he found the way to find comfort in the language. And so I do think that pressing one another in love, calling one another out or inviting one another in, and then finding ways to break bread, to have conversations, to allow us to digest soul food like this alongside real food when it's COVID safe and appropriate, are some of the ways in which with which we shift. But I also want to I think that the thing that I feel Robert also does is remind us that like there are pieces of these people and everybody that we know. Like I think a lot about how problematic Tyler Perry is with regard to affirming problematic gender roles. And one of the things that is often celebrated when people talk about his rich, deserved legacy is that people know the characters, right? Like there's something familiar about that in them. And my hope is that if we can do the work of putting down the weight of white supremacy, then we can find freedom in the familiar and that existing in queer forms. Again, remembering that queer simply means that which is not pejorative. So not queer in the sexuality sense, but just queer in the not white supremacist, not like rooted in everything destructive sense of the term, such that we can all get free. Like that should still be the goal.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you so much. I'm gonna have to figure out a way to have you on, like, to do another like non-book interview with you.
Let's do it. We
We
can
have
even
a
talk about
lot
more books
discussion to
after I finish my
have.
dissertation.
Huh?
I love this book. Tell Mr. Robert thank you for this, brother. I
Yeah,
love
so let
Arthur at the end of the book. He does like the mixtape album shout out.
yeah.
And the one to Toni Morrison melts my heart.
Yes, he has a very thick acknowledgments at the end of the book.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. Just again, right, like situated in community and acknowledging sources of inspiration and connections to other race warriors. Many of them are friends in the movement. I'm just really, really thankful for this gift, and I'm thankful that you insisted I take a break from dissertating to read it. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for taking the time because I did slide into your DMs because I was like, I know you would love it. I know you
I
would love
did.
it, and I was
All of
so
these
shocked
notes,
you.
all of these notes suggest.
I was so shocked you had not heard of it. So I was like, let me slide into his DMs. I need to, and I was like, you know what? I need to be better because there's so many books I've read and so many people that I love and admire. But I'm always like, oh, they're too busy. They're too busy. But
No,
I'm
it
gonna
was
be more.
important. That's what happens when you're, and this will happen to you soon too, when you're dissertating. Like it's the ostrich under the sand, and so
Yeah.
literally, if it was not connected to my lit review, it's on the shelf. There are a bunch of books that I have and just have not prioritized reading. But this one, again, aside from the fact that I really love what you are doing with this community, and I value your recommendations, and I know his work, right? I know the way that he shows up in the world. But I read two sentences on this first page and was like, oh shit, let's go. The question that I have that I don't want to ask out loud, but I'm certain it's already like, I saw this play out in my head in Technicolor, and I just want to be connected to supporting the project. Like,
Oh
I want,
yeah.
like, I don't know who's gonna direct it or what, but like, oh my god, there are like four scenes that I just have to see
On camera.
manifest. Yes, yes, the butterfly scene.
I mean, it's a majestical book. I actually think that the writing does so much to lay out this visual that it just makes sense that it would be like a series. I don't think you could get it. 2 hours isn't enough. There's
No,
way
no, no,
too much
no. We
happening.
need, yeah, we need some
You
like.
got to take
I
care of
was
the
gonna say
audience.
HBO, but HBO is irresponsible with black.
I liked Underground Railroad by Barry Jenkins, which is an Amazon Prime series. I
Barry
loved it.
Jenkins.
I
So
loved it.
Barry is who I prayed about. In part because there's so many there.
Maybe there's somebody I've never heard of because I want to make Hollywood wider. So I'm not going to rely on the people that I already know. But
Well,
some of
Barry
these,
has a team. Barry has a team, but there are
yes,
especially the references
B24,
in the especially in the references to the in the and around moonlight and color. I was like, oh
the
shit, like
purple, the red, and the blue coming together. Yes.
all of it, and the water, like the references to water and the freedom in those spaces. I was like, the ancestors have already made this stuff happen. I need to see. I need more of it. Like to your point about water, I need more. I need more of this. This was so cool.
All right, we're gonna head out, guys. Thank you for joining in, whether you're watching now or later. If you're watching now, please don't forget, submit your questions. We need your questions tonight. All right, bye.